Welcome to this evening's How To Academy. I'm Robin Ince, and today we're going to be talking about this book, which is a fabulous book. It's about two of my favourite things. You will find out what they are. If Nietzsche Was a Narwhal. And in fact, it's probably about three of my favourite things as well, because I love Nietzsche as well. We're joined by Dr. Justin Gregg, who, amongst other things, works with the Dolphin Communications Project and is also a lecturer in animal behaviour and animal cognition. And Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here, Robin. This is going to be great.
Now, because we were talking about this just before we started, and I should also tell everyone, by the way, if you want to send in questions as well, we'll be able to take your questions the last kind of 10, 15 minutes of this as well. But don't ask your questions yet, because quite often we get a lot of questions that get asked and actually they're covered in the previous 40 minutes. So about 7 o'clock, start then, that level of your cognition. I wanted to start off just by talking about, we were talking about John C. Riley, John C. Riley. We could have been talking about him.
He's great.
We were talking about John C. Lilly, who was, for many people, when we hear about dolphin cognition, the things they know about are his work, his trying to teach dolphins what seemed to actually speak kind of human language. And then also some of the what we might call sexual fracas that seem to be around that as well. So I would imagine that dolphin cognition and communication projects have changed somewhat since the kind of more LSD-laced 1960s.
They certainly have. I think after the 60s, there was a bit of a lull after Lilly because there's a pushback. People did not like his sort of brand of crazy science. And so it sat dormant for a little while until the 80s. And then you started anew with these studies to see not if dolphins could learn English, but if they could learn proper symbol systems like you saw with the great apes. And we started finding things out. And so, yeah, so the modern study of dolphin communication focused on that. And now it's really switched over into studying their communication systems and how they communicate between themselves. And that was something Lilly himself at the time was less interested in. So it's definitely gone through an evolution in the past 60 years.
I mean, to some extent, is this really what the book's looking at, which is for perhaps a long period of time, have scientists been judging intelligence by how much can we turn an animal into something like us, as opposed to actually looking at the intelligence of the animal, which may be very different, but equally adapted so well for its environment?
That seems to be it. I mean, this whole thing of, is this animal intelligent, is really just asking the question, does it think like a human? Can it talk like a human? That was the focus for such a long time. And in the 60s, it was this alien issue was actually a big deal. Like, if intelligent life visits us, how do we learn to communicate? How do we learn to recognize it? And so animals were sort of a proxy for the aliens, and we're trying to see if we can get them to speak and see how much they know. But that was always in the context of how humans think. Can they do human stuff? And if they do human stuff, we label them as intelligent and then call it a day. The modern science is less interested in that. We're, I think, more interested in understanding how animals evolved to be in their niche, to do the things that they do, and what are they capable of in ways that are relevant to them and their intelligence.
And I'm sorry, I knew this would happen. You're sending me off on tangents, which we'll get to question one eventually. But I remember Carl Sagan saying that the thing that worried him about extraterrestrial communication was exactly that we can't even communicate with the most intelligent species on this earth. And how do you feel when you look at these different forms of communication and different forms of cognition? What are your hopes that we would be able to communicate with something which had evolved in such a different environment on another planet, somewhere else in this galaxy or the universe?
Yeah, so for a human, we know that there's a mind behind it, translating our thoughts into language. For the animals on this planet, we're sort of on the fence as to the extent of the mind that could be turned into language. And so we don't think that they think the same way we do, and that their symbol systems work like human language. So an alien then presumably has a mind that can figure out how to do interstellar space travel, et cetera, et cetera. And then the question becomes, if they communicate with each other or with us, can we figure out the medium? How do we get the message out of them? Which is why they do things like send up mathematical things into space, because you figure mathematical things are universal. They can translate it in some way. So it's really, and Sagan was talking about that too, cracking the code, figuring out the message to get at the mind behind it.
I always love that line. I remember interviewing Brian Greene a few years ago, possibly for the How To Academy. And there's a line in one of his most recent books in which he says, sometimes I have a nightmare where the extraterrestrials turn up and they see some of the things we've written and they go, oh, yes, we used to be so naive. We thought mathematics was the language of the universe too. A terrifying idea for any mathematician, I think.
That is true. Yeah, and it's always this idea of, do they think like us? And that thinking originates in the biology, right? We always think of natural selection as the only way to get to that mind, but there are other ways of thinking how a being might exist and think that don't involve that. And therefore, communication and thinking and math might be concepts that really are rooted in our biology, as opposed to rooted in all the possibilities of a mind out there in the universe. So yeah, math could just be a juvenile like endeavor on our part.
What actually first drew you to being fascinated with animal cognition? Do you remember at what age it was, or the first kind of stories you read that you thought, this is something that I want to spend a lot of time with?
We had animals in my house growing up, and my mother was in the Humane Society, so always looking out for like abandoned cats and dogs. So just empathy towards animals and being concerned with whether or not they're happy or suffering, that was a big deal in my life. And then when I started to experience wild animals, especially whales, like humpback whales, just from whale watching, I just was fascinated with how big they were, and knowing that they are mammals and that have some kind of intelligence. So I was interested in them. But then my career took a weird path in that I didn't really do science at university or math. I did linguistics because that seemed interesting to me. And then I became fascinated with this question of, well, how did human language evolve? How is it different from the way animals communicate? And then I looped back around to whales and dolphins.
Now that's interesting on the linguistic side of it as well. Is in this book, of course, you look at a lot of different animal experiences, as much as we can understand that from obviously observing from the outside. I mean, that's of course even a problem with looking at other human beings. We are only able to really observe from the outside, and I wonder how much you think about the importance for you, or where you've got to in terms of the importance of having an internal monologue. Because I know that some philosophers and some scientists see an internal monologue, that nature of consciousness, that nature of that level of intelligence that you're dealing with in the book, needs some kind of inner dialogue as well.
This is the question of what even is thought to begin with. And there is no answer. It's a fascinating field. I'll just mention that I talk about aphantasia in the book. That's the inability to close your eyes and picture an image. And so we often think of animals as thinking in images. So they imagine a scenario, where the nut is behind the tree, and they imagine themselves going behind it, and then that's why they go behind it. But it certainly is possible that they don't use, like me, they don't use images to think at all, and they don't use language to think. So then the question is, well, what is thinking? And within psychology, just for you and I, we know that we can execute behaviors without that monologue and without vision, at which point thinking is a third thing, independent, sitting behind images or language and monologues in your brain. So there's no reason to think every animal isn't having lots of complicated thoughts, but no language and no visual thinking.
I find that the aphantasia element, I think, is so interesting, because I only found out, it's only 2 or 3 years ago, I think, reading a book about William Blake, that I found out this thing, which is, this idea that not being able to picture, if I say sunflower, that some people now watching this will, if they close their eyes, they'll be able to picture a sunflower, but other people are not able to picture a sunflower. But that doesn't stop them. For instance, people might think that artists have lots in their head, internal imagination, but I've read that actually quite a few artists, it seems, have aphantasia. It's almost as if by the lack of having it as an internal, they have to externalize it.
Yeah, and there's a Disney animator who has aphantasia who's just brilliant. So it's certainly not a hindrance, and maybe it does drive you forward. For me, I don't quite understand yet if I can hear music in my head the same way my wife does. She claims it sounds just like the radio, whereas I don't hear that at all. But I do a lot of musical things. Like, I love producing music, and maybe the drive is, like you're talking about, precisely because there's nothing in my head. I have to externalize it. So I have to get it out and then experience it back again through creation. So maybe it is a driver for my music creation.
Well, we should get into the book now. Sorry, this is for everyone watching. We are going to, because there's just so much that I want to talk to you about, because I just find it so fun. And as I said, everything leads to another tangent. That's, I mean, that's almost part, one of the first things you talk about in the book is the web of possibilities that human beings have, and what other species that we are able to see, that when something is thrown at you, when an opportunity, when something is visually, when you notice it, that you don't necessarily go, here is the single choice or the binary choice. There are a multitude of possibilities that we face every single day.
Yes, it seems that is a unique thing to humans to some extent. Other species probably do it, but not to our extent, which is if you hear a sound, there's the example in the book, an animal usually has learned association. So things that's encountered in the past that could make that sound, and then that is what it uses to make its decision. Whereas you or I, we could sit for the rest of our lives and come up with a list of things that make sound in the woods. And that would include, like, a shark falling out of a blimp. That was what the sound was. Like, it's just an endless supply, because we can do that. Whereas I don't think other animals can conceptualize along those same lines. And that makes us very powerful thinkers.
Now, I'm so glad that you've brought up the film series Sharknado, but I'm not going to go down that particular tangent.
I work it into every interview.
I would love that if it was just an opportunity to find out that actually you have shares in the Sharknado series. Right. I wanted to also ask why, in terms of Nietzsche as well, what was it about? I mean, Nietzsche, of course, is someone who's been hugely misrepresented at the time, but I would say to many people, one of the greatest philosophers within the entire history of philosophy. But what was it? Why did you think, Nietzsche, this is who I'm going to pin it of all the philosophers it could be?
Initially, I was drawn to him because he's sort of famously unhappy. And so part of the premise of my book was like, thinking too hard makes you unhappy, which was a bit, simple and juvenile. But so when I was looking around, shopping around for philosophers to talk about, the great thing about Nietzsche is he did talk about envying animals because they weren't smart enough to think in complicated ways like humans. He didn't write a lot about animal consciousness and animal thinking, but he definitely wrote that. And that became the jumping off point for the whole book, was his jealousy and pity for animals for not being as smart as a human.
And how much has your understanding of Nietzsche changed as well by looking at his work in doing this book as well and writing this book, and then connecting it to some of the other species that we've talked about, and also just generally looking biographically at him? Yeah,
I didn't know that much about him, to be honest, when I started. And so I talked to some Nietzsche scholars and had to figure out what he was all about as a person, because I needed, we always think of him as like a suffering philosopher. I'm like, well, what specifically, why, and what was going on? And I learned from strangely enough, there's a Nietzsche scholar who lives in my little town in the middle of nowhere, Nova Scotia. And he was like, oh, no, Nietzsche wasn't a miserable person. Yes, he had some mental health issues later on, but he was actually quite friendly, and like, he philosophized with a hammer, they say, or whatever. But in real life, he didn't use it. He was a polite man for the most part. And so that's not the image you have of him. So that changed my mind. And then, of course, figuring out what happened to him in the end of his life, and reading the biographies to see, like, well, what are the diagnoses? Where did he get to, and how did he get there? That I learned a lot about that. And that's apparently still an open mystery as to what was going on with him.
Have you read I Am Dynamite by Sue Prideaux?
I know the name.
That's a great Nietzsche biography. It came out quite recently. And one of the strange things is when you look at his relationship with Wagner, and Wagner would sometimes send him out to go and buy his silk underwear, which is kind of this image of Nietzsche suddenly shopping around for silk drawers for Wagner. I think changes both of them, puts them in a lot more of a kind of situation comedy scenario.
Yeah, I remember reading that passage when later on in Turin, when he was sort of stuck in that apartment and sort of losing it, like he was just naked, like it's like singing Wagner operas or whatever, but not knowing how to play them or knowing any of the lyrics correctly. And that's how I deal with pop music. I don't know the lyrics, but I like to sing them, usually not naked. But there's something endearing about a semi-naked Nietzsche banging out bad Wagner songs.
Yeah, I think, him and William Blake as well in the Garden of Eden. There's beautiful pictures there. Again, webs of possibilities. Now, of course, one of the hardest things when you're starting off by looking at intelligence is, again, the definitions, like the definition of life. Every single time, if you ask a biologist to give a definition of life, they will give one that seems thorough until you go, oh, hang on, like crystals do as well, or whatever it will be. So in terms of the different ways that you were defining intelligence in this book, can you tell me, was there a kind of a journey from how you might have defined intelligence or tried to define intelligence when you started the book that has changed by the end point?
Yeah, I wanted to provide the definition of intelligence. What scholar doesn't want to do that? So I had a few, and it was based on my understanding of animals, because I was interested in animals. But then I was doing the research to see, well, how do the other fields define it? And then you get into psychology and you realize almost none of those definitions apply to animals really. But I wanted one that would also incorporate that. But more interestingly, and I talk about this in the book, like people who study artificial intelligence, who try and create artificial intelligence as a whole field, do not have an operational definition of intelligence at all. They aren't even sure what they're creating. They just happen to work under that field. So the thing I learned doing it is that truly nobody has a good definition. Even people working on intelligence professionally to create it don't, which is why in the book I don't even provide a definition. I don't know if like, it's very subtle. I get to the end of the whole introduction, I'm like, well, there's no actual definition. We all just know it when we see it.
And that in that early chapter, you look at the idea of human beings being why specialists, and what you basically in each chapter of the book, you are quite often starting off with the negative, and then finding the fact with the level of, I suppose, self-consciousness we have and intelligence we have, it really is the returning to the old kind of Buddhist monk cliche: the keys to heaven also open the gates to hell.
That's it. I mean, every chapter is finding that this amazing thing, which is to some extent unique by in our species, or at least doesn't exist to the same extent, is a double-edged sword. It is providing something very beneficial. That's how it got there, through natural selection, but also is probably going to kill us. And so each chapter is this sort of this tension between the good and the bad of the thing. Why specialism? That's our interest in finding out cause and effect, why things happen. That's what science is. I am a science person. You're a science person. It's obviously great. We've got our whole careers based around this thing. That's how we get medicine or whatnot. It's good stuff. Also, it probably is going to kill us in the end. So I'm in love with the thing that is most dangerous to my species.
Yeah, I think, as you say, the why specialist is, why do I exist? Why am I here? And why am I going to die? And, the size of the book required to start that conversation is the size of the Library of Alexandria, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I put that as right up front as the one thing that sort of defines what makes us what we are, is our interest in asking why. And I always say about animals, like there are, chimpanzees or ravens or whatnot in experiments that seem to be interested in cause and effect, but it really is the defining characteristic. And all we do is ask those big questions. Why are we here? Why do we die? That's what makes us human.
Well, if we're talking about cause and effect, let's talk about one of the things you talk about in that chapter, which is the string pulling paradigm, and this kind of brings us back to cats to some extent. Can you tell us what is the string pulling paradigm, and what does that tell us about the intelligence of different species?
Yeah, it's been given to a number of species, birds most famously, and so the idea is there's food hanging at the end of a string, like on a branch. And so let's say a crow needs to get the food closer. So they have to pull the string up with one claw and then hold the string with the other claw and then pull it again. So they have to keep pulling it to get it to come all the way up to them. And so, it'd be difficult to learn that through trial and error. You might accidentally find out the method. But what you see for animals that pass it is that they sort of look at the problem. They understand the nature of what needs to be done mechanically to bring the food closer. And then they go through the process of pulling and holding and pulling and holding. And so one of the explanations, not everyone agrees, is that they understand cause and effect. They know that if I pull here and hold here and wait here, I will get the thing.
It is really